Hello and welcome to the next in our series of character analysis pieces. Today we're going to be focusing on Inspector Goole himself and analysing the different themes he links into, and also looking at the different ways he influences characters and also the messages behind this very, very important character to the story of An Inspector Calls. Now, like Mr. Burling, Inspector Goole, we're going to start off by looking at how he's actually described. Now, he's described as having an impression of massiveness and solidity and purposefulness. Now, the reason J.B. Priestley has done this in the setting of the scene is because the Inspector doesn't need to be a loud shouting character that comes in and tells every other character what they're doing wrong or right. What he needs to do is come in and have an impression on the characters, because he is this strong character that everyone needs to be listening to, and he comes in and he owns the room. It changes the power away from Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling and Gerald and the other characters, and puts it firmly in his hands just from the way that he enters the room and the way he conducts himself. Now, it also talks about how he's also in his 50s. Now, this puts him on a par with Mr. Burling, and this again is to create equality between the two men. Both men are described as being in their middle 50s, and also to create this idea of opposites. Now, whereas Mr. Burling's description is that he's a rather heavy looking man in his middle 50s, the Inspector is described as just being solid, of being purposeful. Okay, and this creates the opposite impression to the one we get of Mr. Burling. So this description of him is to very much put him on a level and make him equal, both in appearance and stature, to the Burling family. And the last bit of his first description is that he's said to look hard at the characters. Now, the reason he's said to look hard at them is this idea that he's looking into everything about them, be it the way that they speak, and also the way that he can sort of look deep into them to get the truth out, or that he already knows what they're about to say. So it's this idea that almost on some level he intimidates the characters that he is speaking to. Now, one interpretation of the purpose of the Inspector is that he is the voice of the author. He is the voice of J.B. Priestley. Now, the Inspector is presented as this socialist figure, and he's trying to push those that he's speaking to accept responsibility for their actions and see how individually they've all contributed to this one event. Now, he talks about this as being a chain of events, and the idea of this chain, that the story follows a chain and that every single person is interconnected with everything that they've done, but also everything that everyone else has done, is a real key theme here, and also a key theme within the socialist ideals that J.B. Priestley is trying to put across. This idea that we are all responsible for each other, and that we all have a social responsibility to look out for one another. And he calls it a chain of events, and he says that he only wants to look at one line of inquiry at a time, and this is so that he can show the way the chain fits together. And it's a very deliberate choice by J.B. Priestley to present the Inspector as this kind of deliberate character that does everything methodically and follows everything through, because if for any reason we had multiple storylines running at the same time, it could get very confusing and the message would be lost. However, the message that the Inspector is trying to deliver is that every single one of these characters has at some point added to the death of Eva Smith, and he's trying to put that across and try to get the characters to realise that they're all responsible for one another. He refers to this as a chain of events, and also very early on in Act 1, when he's speaking to Sheila, he says, "But you are responsible, partly responsible, as is your father." Okay, so trying to make them realise that they all are partly responsible, and that very much leads the viewer to make up their mind, well, who is the most responsible? But J.B. Priestley's message is being displayed through the Inspector. Now, as I've already mentioned, J.B. Priestley is trying to present perhaps his view of the world and his view of how society should run through the Inspector. So the Inspector kind of represents this idea of socialism versus capitalism, in the same way that Mr. Burling and Gerald Croft and Mrs. Burling do on the other side of the coin. Now, as we've discussed before, J.B. Priestley was a socialist, so he presents this opposite view to the view of Mr. and Mrs. Burling and also Gerald Croft. Now he demonstrates this by speaking to them about their responsibilities, and we'll come on to the theme of responsibility later on, but he talks about the idea that everyone is responsible for each other, and he also tries to show this through the inspector having authority over these people who probably consider themselves to be of higher class than the police inspector. So, for instance, a quote is when Mr. Burling is talking, the stage direction for the inspector is cutting in with authority. Now, this shows that the inspector is not scared to cut across people when they're talking, and also to assert his dominance of the situation over these people. Okay, and he's also not scared. He's not trying to sugarcoat anything or to tread lightly around the difficult issues that he's there to speak to them about. So, for instance, he says to Mrs. Burling, "She came to you for help at a time when no woman would have needed it more." And the message that he is trying to put across here is that we should all be looking out for one another, and that they did not do this. Okay, and obviously he's speaking about when when Eva Smith, Daisy, comes to see Mrs. Burling to talk to her about her pregnancy. Earlier, at the end of the story as well, he talks about how there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still with us. And the reason he talks about this is because he's trying to put across that he wants us to be part of a society rather than thinking of ourselves as individuals, and rather than thinking of Eva and Daisy as an isolated incident, he wants people to think about the fact that this is going on every day and that we all need to take some ownership over it, which is why he talks about there being millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. He's talking about there are millions and millions and millions of these working class people, these people that are just getting on with it and trying to make ends meet, that perhaps aren't being considered by the people in the position of Mr. Burling and Gerald Croft and Mrs. Burling, Sheila and Eric, etc. So he's trying to put across this socialist ideal that we should become one society rather than almost operating as different groups of people within society. Without responsibility as a key theme, this play really wouldn't have any kind of key message, and the inspector spends a huge amount of time, and perhaps actually his sole purpose is to get these people to take responsibility for their action, and this key theme, this key message is what really drives him. So he wants every character by the end of the play to have recognised that they have played some part, no matter how small or big, in the eventual death of Eva or Daisy, and that is his ultimate goal. Now, there are several key quotes to prove this. So, for instance, each of you helped to kill her, saying very bluntly to all of these people that they are responsible for her death in some capacity. He tries to force Mr. Burling to take some kind of responsibility for his actions as an employer by saying we have to share something. He's saying we have to share some kind of responsibility for our actions here, because otherwise where are we? He says to all of them right at the beginning, the girl's dead though, a young girl died tonight. So he's trying to use this kind of almost a shock figure to kind of get these group of people to wake up and see where he is coming from, where otherwise they might not have taken any kind of responsibility for it. And then obviously one of the most famous things that he says in the entire play is, we don't live alone, we're members of one body, we are responsible for each other. And this is really the core message of the inspector. He wants every single one of them to realise that to a lesser or greater degree, each of them have had some take in this girl's death, and especially for characters like Gerald and Mr. Burling, and to a lesser and Mrs. Burling, and to a lesser extent Sheila and Eric, that they still have this kind of influence on the other people on their employ, or the other people that come to the charity looking for aid. We have a responsibility to help these people, and what the inspector is looking for is for these people to take the leap from, well, we can't be held responsible for what other people have done, to the jump to, actually, we need to be doing something about this, and we need to accept that we've had a part to play in this. And that's really the point of the inspector. And this again is a socialist ideal that J.B. Priestley is putting across, that humanity and human lives are being affected by these people's decisions. And especially in the instances of, say, Mr. Burling, his reaction to Eva and his sacking of Eva is based purely for trying to keep his factory working, or purely to try and keep wages low. And this capitalist ideal is affecting human lives negatively, and it was the view of the inspector that we should all be taking responsibility for this and recognising that that isn't always the best way to be going about business, and that we need to take social responsibility for every single person in our societies, no matter how rich or poor or vulnerable they may be. As described at the beginning, the inspector has this aura around him of purposefulness and solidity, and the fact that he is not there to mess about, he's there to get a job done. Now, the inspector uses this presence to hold influence over most of the characters in the play, and I say most because Mrs. Burling, for instance, never really accepts that she is influenced by the inspector. In fact, she says that she's the only one that he's not able to get to admit to something, and takes quite a lot of pride in this. However, the inspector does hold some form of influence and power over the other characters in the play, and especially over Eric and Sheila. So obviously Sheila, very quickly after the inspector starts his interrogation of her, starts talking about how she feels awful and how it's her fault that Eva went and killed herself, and how she's the one taking responsibility for all of this. And Eric, obviously, when he finds out that he has lost his child, and that his mother is responsible for that, the inspector has a very profound effect on him. Now, as well as having a very profound effect on these two characters, the inspector also challenges Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and also Gerald to a lesser extent, when they try to use their social class to assert influence over them. So, for instance, Mr. Burling spends quite a lot of time at the beginning in Act 1 talking to the inspector and saying about how he was Lord Mayor, about how he knows the police chief, about how he's still a serving magistrate. And the inspector uses his influence and his power to bounce that back on him, saying, public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. So saying immediately to him, you can't use your power of social class and your public life over me, because your public influence also means that you must be held to account for when you do things that are wrong. And that is what he's trying to say here. So the inspector is flipping what Mr. Burling previously thought of as a power play, to force him to, think about his actions. And we see this must have had an effect on Mr. Burling, because in our other video to do with Mr. Burling's character, we see Mr. Burling panicking because he's worried about a public scandal, because he is so much in the public eye. Now, the inspector is seen as this omniscient character, this character that knows everything, and this rubs off on people like Sheila. She says, of course he knows, when he's interviewing Gerald. So Sheila obviously is affected deeply by the inspector, and clicks onto very early on that he knows everything that he's asking for. He just wants to hear them say it, which links into the theme of responsibility. The inspector isn't trying to find out anything he doesn't already know. He is just trying to find out. He's just wanting them to say it, to take responsibility for their actions. And Sheila clocks onto this very, very early on in the play, and this effect that he's had on her means that she, rather than worrying about what she's going to say. Just saying to other people, just tell him, because he already knows. So just tell him. He's had that powerful impression on her. And the inspector obviously realises this power that he has, because he says we often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable. Now, whether he uses this deliberately, or whether it is simply he's commenting on the effect that police officers and police inspectors would have on the young rather than the old, is up for debate. However, what you can infer into this is perhaps he's talking about being able to take responsibility for their actions. Perhaps he's talking about the fact that they are less set in their ways than the elder generation in the room, such as Sheila's mother and father. The Sheila switches so quickly to taking responsibility. Perhaps what he's talking about here when she says they're more impressionable, he's talking about they are more likely to buy into the ideas that he is talking about, and he is trying to get them to understand. And then lastly, he speaks to the characters about them using their power to punish the girl. So he again uses his power to get them to admit and to speak about what they have done, that he wants to hear them talk about, to hear them take responsibility for their actions. And equally, he wants to flip their power against them. Now, he's already done this once with Mr. Burling, as we've just spoken about. But he talks about using their power to punish the girls. So whereas he's using his power for good to find out the truth, and to put them in a position where positives can come out of this situation, he is showing how they have used their power for evil, to coin a phrase. Lastly, we're just going to look at who actually is Inspector Goole. Now, the Inspector, as I've spoken about a lot, is widely interpreted to be the voice of J.B. Priestley, to be putting forward the views that he sees. However, we need to look at the name itself, Goole. Now, this sounds very, very much like a play on the word ghoul, which is another word for a ghost or a malign spirit. So perhaps J.B. Priestley is trying to present him as a ghost, as someone that comes and delivers a message and then leaves. So perhaps the inspector never really existed at all. Is he actually just a projection of the guilty consciousness of the characters, that they are worried subconsciously about what they've done, and this is just a projection of their conscience talking to them, manifesting itself as the inspector? Is that perhaps the case? Or the other interpretation is it the voice of God, or a God telling them that they've done something wrong that they need to repent for? We need to again look at the context of the time to really look into that. In that, in the 40s, though science was taking off, people would have still been more perhaps religious than they are today in certain areas. So, is this voice of God perhaps trying to get them to repent for something? Now, these things are very, very much up for individual interpretation. However, if you were to look at the idea of it being the voice of J.B. Priestley, then you need to consider what message is he trying to put across, and equally you need to consider why would J.B. Priestley have done any one of these four things, or is there anything else that you can speak about? Now, it is not my intention to tell you the right answer. This is, as I say, very much up for you to decide on. But whatever you decide, just make sure that you are able to speak about why you think that, and be able to say, if you think he's presented as a ghost, why? If you think he's the voice of J.B. Priestley, why? If you think that he's the conscience of the characters, why? If you think that actually is the voice of God, why? You need to make sure that you are able to say why you believe these things, because otherwise they're just wild statements, and in an exam, wild statements unfortunately aren't going to get you anywhere. So, form your own opinion on who you think the inspector is and what his purpose is, and then just make sure that you are able to discuss why. Thank you very much for watching.